Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for another webinar focusing on what kind of various magic you can do with dimensions data. And I have the pleasure of introducing you Tung Tung and Bijan, and they've been working on a very interesting Sustainable Development Goals dashboard. I will leave it to them to explain the thinking and the philosophy behind it, and feel free to ask any questions regarding the presentation or the data itself. And thank you again. Floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tung Tung, and I am the Research Intelligence Advisor at Erasmus University, Rotterdam. So my job is to prepare strategic advice, as well as be in these sort of evidence-based policy making in sustainable development goals, societal impact, as well as reward and recognition right now in the Netherlands. And with me today, who is thinking about building and thinking about sustainable development goals, is also Bijan. Bijan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, sure. Hello, everyone. I am Bijan Ranjbar, a freelance data scientist and machine learning expert. Last year and also the beginning of this year, it has been a privilege to work with Tung Tung on this very interesting project for Erasmus University Rotterdam. I'm going to tell you more about the machine learning techniques I've used for this project a bit later in this presentation.
Yeah. So I'll dive right into it. The reason why we're interested in SDG is because our university have a new strategy, which is creating positive societal impact until 2024. And one of the question, of course, sustainable development goal is only one framework to look into societal impact, to look into what is the relevance of researchers and their research according to all these 17 goals. However, I think it's important to know that these are goals, right? They're targets, they're actions, and they're not a thesaurus, which means that they're not a dictionary, a synonym, which you can look up, oh, let's look into poverty, and then trying to sort of start indexing article on the basis of these words. So I think it's important to mention that because these are targets, there is no ground truth, and there's no absolute truth on how to interpret these things. So at Erasmus University and in my role, I'm just considering how do we encourage researchers to be more open and involved in reaching these goals through their work. The reason for this is that SDG is from the UN and has been accepted by many institutions and organizations. It's still a very much top-down policy-oriented thing. So I believe that it will take an entire community to reach these global targets. So what can SDG policymakers, publisher tool developers do to foster understanding and inspire action? So this is the sort of the context in which we are coming from. And of course, when we think about SDG, there are a lot of scholars who've researched about this. So I think there are four very important questions to consider when you're thinking about indexing it to research. So one is that how were the SDGs interpreted? And how do we delimit the relevance of the selected approach? How do we check the quality of the selected approach? And how do we validate it? And who developed the search strings and method? And what data sources were used? So these are the four key questions to ask when thinking about mapping research publication to SDG, according to Armitage, Lawrence, and Mickey. And here I will present the existing SDG indexing method that is out there. So of course, one thing you can do when looking at SDG and research is to read it on the article level and then start tagging them. Another thing that is on the article level, and on the author level, you can also pinpoint an author or a researcher and look into this researcher profile and thinking that, oh, I'm a researcher that actually focused on, say, no poverty or yeah, and so on. So other types of SDG like quality education, if you're an education researcher. Or you can also look into the level of journal and see if, for example, sustainability journal, then it's quite clear which kind of SDG they're also focusing on, or on a departmental level, depending on the research groups that you're based. So that is manual indexing. Another one would be a keyword-based approach, which is adopted by the Aurora network. They developed a kind of search string and a combination of keywords that represent a certain SDG and index that on the basis of that. The third one would be a supervised machine learning classifier, which needs training data. I think this is also done by my other colleague at Erasmus University Rotterdam in RSM, Rotterdam School of Management, by Wilfred, and Dialogic. We also have dimensions. I believe that you, in your SDG indexing, you also have training data for that. And for us today, me and Bijan is presenting the fourth method, which is unsupervised machine learning classifier, which we don't need training data for. And of course, all these four approaches have their advantages and disadvantages. And today we're not here to discuss those pros and cons, but we're just presenting the variety of approaches that are out there and why we decided to use an unsupervised machine learning classifier. And Bijan will talk about the pipeline from here.
Yes. Sure, thanks, Tung. So the starting point for this, like the pipeline for SDG indexing, is the raw data. And of course, we use the dimension data. You can get it via API, Google BigQuery, or just the interface. So for us, all alternatives, depending on the use cases, we give it a try. And sometimes we need to also add the HR data, like internal library data, to enrich this raw data. So once we have the raw data, we have to clean it. Like you need to get rid of all those empty records that sometimes pop up. You need to get rid of any type of document you're not interested in, and so on and so forth. Normalization, which is more like splitting data into right form of tables, that you make sure data is not redundant and it's very easy to retrieve it. And of course, standardizing it. So if there are certain affiliations that are not written in the way you like them to be, for example, we standardize them. Once we have that, next step is actually the indexing, which we're going to talk about it a bit more in the next slides. And the indexing gives you this publication data with SDG indexes. And by SDG index, we are referring to, for example, the confidence that we know this publication is related to SDG 4 or SDG 8. So it's a kind of a linking between publication and SDG. And once we have that, we do the aggregation. So we collect basically, and we aggregate all the data at the level of specific schools or specific authors or journals, and that gives us a lot of additional information. So that's the kind of easy pipeline. Let's look at an example. So I took this example from Dimension website. There's a specific paper called The Relation Between Students' Effort and Monitoring Judgments During Learning, a meta-analysis. And the first author is from Erasmus University. This publication is published in Educational Psychology Reviews. And I want to ask you to think about which of those 17 SDGs you think this publication is about. So we have keywords like student, we have learning there. Also, it's in Educational Psychology Review journal. So well, we think like SDG 4 is a fair choice, which is quality education. And if you think about how we can make that inference, only looking at the title and looking at the journal name by itself can tell us a lot about what this article is about. We understand that the abstract of this article can even give more information. The full text of this article can also give more information. As Tung previously mentioned, we have colleagues at Erasmus University Rotterdam that they are looking at abstract and full text, and they have really good results. But for us, it was important to keep the method simple and also keep it general. Like we know that there are publications at universities that we don't have access to the full text, or even there are publications we don't have access to the abstract. So we only focus on the title and journal name from here on to keep it simple and transparent. Then in the next slide, here is how we actually do the SDG indexing. So on top left, you see the journal name, colon, the title of the article, just the example you saw. On the right, you see quality education, actually the name of the SDG. And the question we're asking is how similar are these two texts together? What is the semantic similarity? Nowadays, there are very powerful text encoders that allow you to encode a text into a vector of numbers. And then those vector of numbers, in this case, the left vector and the right vector, are encoded such that if the two phrases on top are similar, the two vectors below should also be very, very similar and close to each other in terms of the like Euclidean distance or cosine similarity. And I have to mention that usually those vectors are extremely long. So we have them of length like 765, for example. And it's not 0 and 1 in them, but you have like all type of float numbers between 0 and 1, for example. So that's the original idea. Let's encode text from documents. Let's also encode text from SDGs, only the titles and descriptions of those SDGs, and see how close are they similar. So if you go to the next slide, I just wanted to mention very quickly how these text encoders, like what's the state of the art of these text encoders. These days, let's say since 2018, there have been so many famous text encoders produced. If you look at BERT, which is one of the very first and most famous encoders, the basic version of BERT has 110 million parameters. And if you look at the row related to data, this model is trained on 16 gigabytes of data that contains a lot of book corpuses and Wikipedia pages. The rest of the models are even trained on more data. We also have these days GPT-2 and 3, which is also like trained on a lot more data. These text encoders are like language models. They do exactly what I explained in the previous slide. They take a text and encode it into a vector of numbers, and those vectors tell us a lot. So if we go to the next slide, using the distance between those articles and the SDGs, you can imagine that SDG will be at the center of all those circles, like SDG I. It can be, imagine SDG 4. And then in this example, SDG 6 and 7 are extremely close in terms of distance, that's semantic distance. And then SDG articles 1, 5, 8, 9 have slightly more distance or less similarity to that specific SDG, and then the rest of the articles are even have more distance. So you can come up with a kind of like regions for very low confidence if they're too far from the SDG, intermediate confidence if they're closer, and very high confidence if they're super close. And imagine you do this for every SDG. So for each single SDG, all your articles in the space have a distance. And from that, you can easily decide which SDG is the most relevant to which article. So the next slide, yeah, is that for you, Tung Tung?
Yes. So
Yes.
now I'm going to talk about our first interactive dashboard. So as a result of the method that we choose, we made this dashboard. Let me see. I've opened it right here. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So here, this is the first interactive dashboard where we choose to use Scopus open access data between 2015 to 2020, which is a 6 years worth of data. And you will see that in total, there are 3,301 publications, and each publication is a dot, is a node. And you will see 4 colors, one of social sciences and humanities, red, green, health sciences, blue, physical sciences, and yellow, life sciences. And these are the disciplines being tagged already by Elsevier. So if I would choose SDG number 1, no poverty, you would see that the article started moving. So as Bijan already told you about the confidence interval level, the closer it is, or the more the article it is in these intersection of here, the more relevant it is to the SDG number 1. So here we see the title, why are depressive symptoms more prevalent among the less educated? So if we click on the dot, we will be immediately brought to the Google Scholar page, which we know the researcher, the source title, as well as access to the research. And so here, source, we have a couple of selection of journal as well. So we can see, say, if I choose +1, it seems that all their articles are quite far from no poverty, which means that this journal don't really work on poverty issues, for example. So at Erasmus, we're wondering if the research that we published are relevant to the Netherlands, Rotterdam, or the EU, for example. So we can look into our regional, national, and say international influence. If I would click the Netherlands, we will also see that here is also quite far from no poverty here. So we can say that we're not really focusing on that here in the Netherlands. But if I would choose another, for example, good health and well-being, you will see that Erasmus University, we focuses a lot more on good health and well-being in the Netherlands, and so on. So if I would remove this, these are experimental where we try to see if there are certain words or keywords that we want to see. And author, if we would pick a researcher, we would see that this researcher, how interdisciplinary he is. We will see the number of publication in this radar chart, and also highlight the number of publication and how close they are to a certain SDG. So this was our first attempt and our prototype. And as I've explained before, here is how we identify the confidence level of each article according to the SDG. But here, the reason why we call it this first attempt is because we still find it very difficult for our stakeholders and our colleague to navigate this interactive dashboard and make sense of it. And so we had a second attempt. Bijan, would you like to talk about the second attempt?
I can talk about it. So what happened is that we had to increase the amount of data in the second attempt. That was when we started to use the Dimensions API and getting like a lot more data for like 15 years in a larger scale from Dimension, which happened very, very smoothly and easily. We had to rerun the SDG indexing in a bit more precise way. We did a lot of data aggregation at the level of like journals, schools, and so on and so forth. And we improved the look and feel of the dashboard, basically using Google Data Studio. This is the whole workflow. So the first step, basically, we had to collect data. So if Tung Tung, you do one click, would be great. Yes. So the first step was collecting data from Dimensions and extracting titles, abstracts, journal names, and so on and so forth. The second step was about using the machine learning model or that those text encoders I explained to transfer every single article into its vector that later we can compare to SDGs. Then the third step was to actually deploying the dashboard, so building the dashboard, bringing all the information to the dashboard, and finally the last step was about reaching the final like end users and researchers and trying to see how they interact with the overall dashboard. So next slide would be, yeah, Tung Tung, do you want to introduce the dashboard?
Yes, so this is the dashboard that we built. I already have here, this tab. Right, full screen, right. So here, as Bijan already mentioned, we have access to Dimensions API, and as a result, we have a much more publication. So before, remember our first attempt, it was only 3,000 open access article. So the result wasn't that interesting and relevant for the board, for example, and the research deans. So with 16,000 publication and 13,000 authors and more, and also 3,392 source titles, I think here also include book chapters as well. And here we have citations and the Almetric score. So we were able to really make full use of the Dimensions data that we obtained. And interestingly, we can also select, say, the years that we're interested in to look at, the open access status. And here we are trying to compare or trying to see, so SDG Dimensions have their own SDG indexing as well. So we see, but because they have a training set and we don't, they also identify, we were able to identify more publications than the one in Dimensions. But I think these are good information to cross check it, and I will show how we do that later. And then we go down, we can select also the journal to look at. And here we are trying to see, extract our school name and affiliation to look into departmental sort of research of SDG. And here we have each researcher to select. And thanks to also dimensions data, we also have funding information as well as fields of research category. So if I would look into good health and well-being research, it will take a while to load, and it will show a list of the articles that are here. There are 3,642 of them, which we can read and select. And these, every single article, I'm going to restart it. Let's choose. Let's choose a journal.
Should be okay, Tung. Yes.
Yes.
Slowly.
And so, yes, less. And so when we click on an article, immediately we will be brought to, say, the dimensions page as well, and look into all the other details. And here, so in this journal, Value in Health, we see that most of it is good health and well-being, and we can check it indeed. Also in dimensions, good health and well-being, we also identify zero hunger, clean water and sanitization, responsible consumption and production, which is different from, say, SDG 8 and 4 that were also identified. So here we can basically see as well, if we return to researchers only, it will select, say, these are all Arvin, of course, the same researcher at Erasmus University, and you can see that author disambiguation, we've not really done that yet. And there are 50 publications from this professor, and we can also see that how he can profile himself and what kind of research he's working on. And unknown here, it means that our classifier was not able to identify any other SDG. So they're in the publication, and that's why they're classified as unknown. And there's like one publication that is unknown. And so here we also can see how our research and which faculty he's from, what are the funding agency, and what are the fields of research this researcher is busy with. And so I think these would enable us as well to help researcher and professors to help write their narrative for funding agency as well, because they may not be aware of the SDG they're working on. So this is our second dashboard. And so in summary, our second dashboard was better received because we've were able to index all Erasmus University publication between 2005 and 2020. Of course, our input is the title of the article and the source title from Dimensions publication, and we compare that with the description of SDGs from the UN, and then the output is, of course, the classification. The methodology, as Bijan already explained, is semantic similarity. And so we calculate the confidence level of these SDG instead of having a binary approach of, say, true or false, whether yes or no, but rather we have a degree of, say, confidence level. And I think the advantages of this unsupervised machine learning is that it does not need any manual labels or initial query as compared to other approaches. And also, we are able to process human language in a general way, right? And so that these sort of text encoder would also be able to detect new terminology that will appear in the future documents. Since we're using only title and source title, it's very scalable and can be applied to large corpora without any limitation as compared to an abstract or full text, for example. So I think the take-home messages today is that these kind of dashboards or tools actually create or bring more questions to openness in the case of SDG, because I think possibility is very important because SDG, as we know, these four different, all the existing methods out there creates a different kinds of problematization, which means that whether it's Tung Tung or whether it's Bijan looking at the SDG, our interpretation might be different. And that's why it's important that we show what are the specific way of defining, framing, and categorizing these research output. And this is also why we use the dimension SDG indexing as a form of comparison. Hey, you see, it can return different SDG per researcher or per journal. And so how can our tools in the creation of these tools make this visible? Second of all is accessible. Like I said, with our first dashboard, it's not very accessible because a lot of people didn't understand what is the X and Y axis in the dashboard. And so I think also having to educate them and explain in this entire process, understanding and engaging with others, we were able to envision a more pluralistic approach to foster new ways of experimenting and also working with dimensions on that. And debatable. So I think in the end, like how I started in the beginning, as it's a very much policy-oriented sphere and language, I think it's important to include researchers in debating and assigning SDG relevance. So finally, I want to close with other possibilities in this whole SDG indexing exercise is that open methodology will help us all to test, compare, and stimulate different forms of visualizing and tagging SDG in research. And of course, that can also be applied to other forms of output, not only publications, but course guide and so on. Crowdsourcing, I think this is something to consider because it offers a diversity of perspective. Of course, it's difficult to reach a consensus, but if there is technology that could facilitate that, I think that would also be very wonderful. The third one is non-binary. So instead of true and false classification, we can say, hey, this research actually also related to other forms of SDG instead of completely cutting it out and trying to box it in one group. And finally, I think we all need to consider as builders, policy advisor, who is responsible, or publishers, database people, who is responsible for assigning the SDG relevance? Is it the authors? Is it the data scientists? Is it policymaker or publishers? How do we work together to actually help bring about and realizing the goal of SDG in the future? So that's all to my presentation. And yeah, me and Bijan welcome any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tung Tung. Thank you, Bijan. This has been very, very interesting. And thank you again for coming here today. If there are any questions, feel free to add them in the question box or in the chat box, whichever one you find first. And also, if you would like to be unmuted, please raise your hand. And I see a raised hand here, or not. There was a raised hand. Oh, there it is. Jeffrey, you're unmuted now, so you have full control over your microphone. Jeffrey?
We are, yes. Hello, my name's Jeffrey. I'm watching from Canada there. I'm at McMaster University, and I've had some questions recently about SDGs. And first of all, I really like your dashboards there and your sort of text mining approach. I did some text mining years ago, but now I do scientometrics and bibliometrics and that sort of thing. But the last part of your presentation really gets to the crux of the matter. The policy makers at the university, they don't have time to understand the X and the Y graph, the axes of the graph. They just want a number. They want an answer. And that's something that I encountered in my work at McMaster, that the policymakers want the biggest number possible because it looks good. How do we and so all the complexity that you've drawn out from the documents is great, but I mean, I just don't understand how how this feeds into the SDG goals and moreover the rankings, which is what the policymakers really care about. So I don't really have a question here, but
yeah, but I think I can definitely answer that because
it's the issue.
It's basically
so
everyone wants to use SDG to demonstrate their success, right? It's basically trying to showcase how good they are, instead of questioning, okay, are we really doing something in SDG? So I think in creating the dashboard and showing the different interpretation, having already say our unsupervised algorithm with that of the dimensions tagging, because at first at our university, when they asked about SDG, what I did was delivered the publication by dimensions, and everybody was very unhappy because the number of publication was so low. And that was the reason why we started this as well within our institution, and so does Utrecht University and University of Amsterdam, in order to identify more research, more like bigger numbers. Of course, there is sort of a tension because and we have a task force called Evaluating Societal Impact to deal with this issue. So we have a group of data scientists and me, research intelligence advisor, guiding the process so that these numbers won't be abused. Does that answer your question, Jeffrey?
Yes, they want the biggest numbers. My only observation and complaint about this whole SDG approach is that as each university takes its own approach to answering the SDG questions, it makes the results incomparable. That each university has their own custom way of defining what an SDG is and how they respond to it, which is lovely, but it makes it impossible to compare, University of Toronto versus University of Erasmus. And so everything becomes a custom job. It becomes basically an art piece. Now, it's really interesting and it might be useful for policy, but it doesn't make it useful for strategizing, for comparing University A against University B. And that's just my only complaint. It's about not your project, but about SDGs in general. And why don't we all just standardize on the dimensions? So queries, or Elsevier has a set of queries that they came out with in 2019. Let's all use the same queries and then we can compare them. But I guess the numbers aren't big enough, I guess. That's
and so the thing that was most interesting for me when I was talking to Tung Tung about the whole SDG was the approach that the SDG shouldn't be seen as a form of impact, but rather because no one really was thinking about SDGs 3 years ago, and let alone have a proper strategy around it. And the more discussions there are around sustainable development goals and what we want to achieve, rather than say, oh, we have 500 publications in Sustainable Development Goal 4, which means it's 10% of everything that is out there, which makes us the greatest in our country. But then you still have poverty in your city. And that is the one sentence that, from discussing with Tung Tung, because this is all her, that we should look at sustainable development goals through what we can fix with our own communities first, and maybe see how we can then translate it into impact and metrics and all of the other fancy stuff that we like to talk about, but also have an actual impact over around the community that we live in.
Exactly. So one of the thank you, Christina, because one of the reasons why I designed the dashboard and also focusing on researcher is so that some researcher can challenge it and be like, hey, what? Why am I under gender equality? I've never think that when I'm doing my research, that's not what I'm focusing on. It's actually something else. And I think having it out there allows researchers to question, say, first the SDG policy hype. And also, like, I don't think benchmarking is possible. How can you compare who is solving poverty better than the others? That's not possible. I mean, and that's also why there's so many interpretation and so many different methods, because of these so many disagreement interpretation of there's no ground truth. Yeah. But Bijan, on a technical level, what do you think?
Yeah, indeed. I thought from a technical perspective and data-driven perspective, I also find it very important to keep the whole process as transparent as possible and look at all the results in details and not in an aggregated way. And the reason is just also, as Jeffrey said, like every university, every institute nowadays is developing their own SDG indexing methods, which is a great thing. I also agree, but there's also the danger that some of these methods are biased to a specific type of publications, or something goes wrong. And if we don't keep it transparent and don't show it in detail, then there's no way to check it. Like, you just get all these aggregated values for different departments or universities, and it's just so hard for anyone to question it. So I think, yeah, from that perspective, also I think it's probably very crucial to keep those details visible and make sure everyone has access to that.
Yeah.
Thank you. There are a few more questions. From Sharon, hi, how does your identification of Sustainable Development Goals alignment differ from the filter currently in Dimensions? And maybe we can answer that together, I guess, because there would be differences, just like we were talking about earlier, regardless of the approach. But even if it is the same approach, but a different corpus of documents, the result would be different.
Yeah.
There will definitely be overlaps, but there will also be differences. And the more differences, the better. And the more we analyze all of the different approaches, which is one of the many reasons I was grateful for the two of them being here today, is that the more we talk about this and the more we look at what every one of us is doing, the more ideas we have to maybe align at one point in the future.
Yeah.
And yes, the audio will be sent. I should have sent this in the beginning, as well as my name, which I forgot to say. So I'm Chris, I'm the product specialist. Should have sent this at the beginning, but I was just too excited. So there is another question here. Thank you, Tung Tung and Bijan, for the presentation and the demoing of your dashboard. I came to the webinar a bit late and missed how you tagged the Sustainable Development Goals on the publications. What was the methodology and what was used to tag Sustainable Development Goals?
So, okay, so in a very like compact way, I think the recording will be there as well, right?
Yes.
But I will keep it very short. So we take an article, and then from the article we take the journal name and title of the article. We concatenate them, and we have a text. And then we have the SDG description and title also, and then those two next to each other, we try to find how similar they are to each other. We use text encoders, so we transfer both text into vectors of numbers, and then we calculate how similar they are. And the more similar an SDG is to an article, the more relevant that SDG. And that's the main idea behind how to do this SDG indexing.
Yeah.
Thank you. I hope that answers your question. There is another one. Did I hear correctly that you selected only open access articles? If so, why?
Oh yeah, so that was the first prototype. You did hear correctly. For the open access article, we only used 3,000 because that will allow us to prototype quickly.
But the second attempt was all publications available on Dimension from
yeah, and
Erasmus.
then it was 16,000 articles. Yeah.
Another question, interesting talk. How did you check the quality of assigning single articles to Sustainable Development Goals? I imagine that there were some incorrectly indexed articles as well. Thank you.
Bijan, do you want to take this?
Well, I can give a few statements, and then Tung Tung can add to that. So first of all, we find it very difficult to check the quality because there is no ground truth. Like, even if you have sometimes asked the authors of articles, and like it's very subjective what SDG is there. So not having a ground truth. Also, Dimensions SDGs are also not very complete, so it's very hard to compare with them. First of all, we find it very difficult to quantify the quality of these matches. that's, I think, one important point. The second point is that, well, it's transparent. So the dashboard is there, and we let the researchers and different users to play with the dashboard, look at examples, and see what's their feeling. So is it that they all the time see issues with the SDGs or not? So that's one way to get a bit of feeling of how good the quality is. Aggregation also helps us to check. So if we compare two schools, one is very active in economy, the other is very active in law, and then if we check how are the SDGs of their publications in total, how they compare, that can also give us some indication of how good the quality is. And we also have a few other methods available at the Erasmus University, so we can also compare the SDGs there. Tung Tung, I don't know what you can add.
Yeah, so in one of my slides in the beginning about what are the questions, so Armitage et al. In last year published this article on the very severe lack of overlap in different SDG tagging methodologies. They compare the Elsevier method and also the Aurora network method, which is search strings based, and they found out that every different discipline have a very different preference for keyword. So the combination of search strings became very different, which influenced the result. So the Bergen University had barely any overlap. So that's also what Bijan has said in the beginning, because there's no ground truth. It's very difficult to check the quality of the data. So the best we can do is to make sure that it's easy for us to question it and to see the level of article, and also compare these differences between algorithm. Hopefully that our tooling and the sort of setting of our dashboard allows for that, so that people can talk about it, because it's quite hard to say, to quantify and say, oh, this is a better quality, or this confidence level signify this or that. So yeah, it's very difficult. Yeah, but we try.
Thank you. And there are a few more questions. Will anyone be able to use the tool at some point? And if so, how will it be accessed?
So I think for us, it's still in the proof of concept phase, which means that now we're running pilots and also experimenting. Like I said, our university strategies until 2024. We would actually have a task force and also researchers working on this issue. So how should this dashboard be open and be used by the others? Right now, it's only used for internally, so as research intelligence advisor, guiding other research directors in looking into it. Otherwise, we have not really want to open it yet, because we think that the other possibilities that I mentioned at the end, do we want to crowdsource this? Do we want to create some kind of SDG Impact Month to educate everyone about these differences and how we can achieve these goals as community? So I think at that stage, it's still not open to the public yet.
Thank you. And there's one question from Shaya from University of Groningen. Thank you very much for thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. Have you tried for other Dutch universities?
You mean applying the same methodology to other Dutch university?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. So the answer is no, because we don't have access to their data. But I can imagine it would be very fun if, say, Groningen would say, hey, we want to do this too, and we want to index the article. And I think definitely there's a chance to do it together. Yeah.
Thank you. So there are no more questions that I can see. Shaya says thanks. And yeah, there are no more questions for now. But if anyone thinks of any more questions or would like to get in touch with you, you can either just write to me or to anyone at Dimensions team, or directly to Tung Tung.
Yeah, can just email me at chan@eur.nl. Yeah, CHAN@EUR.nl. Very, very simple. Yeah. Yeah.
If there are, so Jeffrey says a very elegant solution to a very tricky issue. And that is a very elegant way of putting it. So thank you for that. If there are no more questions, I do thank everyone, and especially to you guys, Tung Tung and Beijan, for coming and for being inspiring. And we'll keep in touch, all of you.
Yeah,
Have a have a lovely rest of your day. And I'm looking forward to the next API training that is in 2 weeks from now.
Yeah. All right.
Bye.
See you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.